I guess we can start now, right? All right, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you who have joined us today. And welcome to this fourth edition of the Adaptation Pipeline Accelerator webinar series, exploring monitoring, evaluation, and learning of adaptation. My name is Prakash Bista, a technical specialist on adaptation planning with UNDP, and I will be moderating this webinar today. Monitoring, evaluation, and learning, or MEL as we call it, is an essential aspect of any effective adaptation strategy, allowing us to track progress, identify gaps, and refine our approaches to protect vulnerable communities and ecosystems. MEL systems provide critical lens that allow us to assess the effectiveness of resilience building efforts. By establishing clear, measurable indicators, we can monitor the impact of our interventions on aspects of community well-being, from infrastructure resilience, for example, to social cohesion and economic stability. And through inclusive evaluations, we can gain insights into strengths and weaknesses of our approaches, allowing us to make informed decisions. The learning part, which is really at the heart of the MEL system, in transforming evaluation findings into actionable knowledge. With continuous learning, we can ensure that lessons learned from our experiences are not left collecting dust in some obscure bookshelf, but are actively being used in design and implementation of new and future programs. But how do we do all of this effectively when at the global level, so much is left undecided? To unpack the MEL system for adaptation, its interconnectedness with the global processes, and to hear experiences on building national and sectoral level MEL systems, we have a very exciting panel of speakers lined up for you today. Just a few housekeeping announcements first. Please note that this webinar is being recorded. Simultaneous interpretation is available in French and Spanish. You can change the language by clicking on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your Zoom window. It is most likely on original audio at the moment. Please select any of the three languages there, English, French, or Spanish. I would like to also request our audience to please engage actively in the conversation. You can use the chat function to post any questions that you may have as we go through the presentations, and we will try to respond to as many of them as possible in order. Before we jump into the discussion, however, we have a very quick poll that we have to see what stage of adaptation MEL cycle our audience may be in currently. So if I could request the poll to be launched, please. There you have it. So this is a poll on our adaptation MEL journey. And the question is, if climate change adaptation, monitoring, evaluation, and learning system was a journey, at which stage would you place yourself or your organization or your country? So we'll maybe give another couple of seconds for the responses to trickle in. All right. They're still coming in, so let's see, 62%. All right, I think that's okay. Let's stop now. Let's end the poll. And if we look at the distribution there, quite a few responses are at very early stages of the monitoring, evaluation, and learning cycle. 29% are at somewhat advanced, and very few on a completely functional adaptation MEL system, and 9% on no idea about the MEL system, and we are here to learn, which is not really surprising, colleagues, if I may say so, because we are all at different stages of adaptation planning and also on monitoring and evaluation of our adaptation actions. So this pretty much confirms as well what we were expecting to see from this poll that we're at different stages. So thank you very much for taking your time to respond. Now, before we continue with the panel, I would like to please invite Ms. Rohini Kohli, who is our Senior Technical Advisor on Adaptation Policy and Planning, to provide some opening remarks and some words of wisdom. Rohini, over to you.
Hi, Prakash. Thank you very much. I'm great to join the session.
Rohini, we cannot hear you.
Okay.
Okay, we hear you now.
Yeah. I'm so sorry for that. It could be that there was a technical glitch. So let me just firstly begin by welcoming everyone on behalf of UNDP to this session. We are organizing this webinar as part of a series of interactions this year on topics relevant to acceleration under the Adaptation Pipeline Accelerator initiative of the Climate Action Team of the SG's office, to which UNDP, GCF, and the NDC partnership are the co-partners. And we are very pleased to be organizing this in collaboration with the SCALA program, which is a co-led FAO and UNDP initiative on land use and agriculture in NDCs and NAPs. UNDP's work on adaptation acceleration builds on the work we are doing through the Climate Promise to help countries achieve their nationally determined contributions, as well as the work we are doing with 50 countries on the National Adaptation Plans, and also the work we're doing on the ground with 100+ countries on adaptation in ecosystems, coastal management, agriculture, livelihoods, early warning systems, and water management, to name some of the thematic areas. Our support to countries on National Adaptation Plans is advancing, with countries gradually building up their national monitoring, evaluation, learning systems for adaptation. Also, at the same time, the work with NDCs, which UNDP is spearheading, we're also seeing stronger targets and goals, especially related to adaptation in the NDCs, as well as on the support to countries on the enhanced transparency framework, which includes the work on biannual transparency reports, in which adaptation is being covered by countries. In most cases, most countries are opting for adaptation, and it's entirely voluntary. So the work on national communications on the NDCs, the NAPs, and the enhanced transparency framework is very, very critical to build these national systems for the MEL, as we call it, but it's monitoring, evaluation, learning, and reporting. But as we are learning from the global stocktake, the world is quite far off in terms of gauging adaptation progress, and there are many needs and gaps before us. From the stocktake, we have learned that unfortunately, we are not close to meeting the goal of the Paris Agreement. In the present trajectory, we're looking at a much higher rate of rise of temperature. And that means we are not on track for the temperature goal, and that affects the achievement of the global goal on adaptation, and it makes progress much more difficult. Loss and damage is a huge issue now, as we are starting to breach the limit of adaptation. So this is a huge issue for the communities and people on the ground, and to governments that have to do a driving seat of action, and also the international community that needs to rise to this challenge. So while it's critical to accelerate the progress on adaptation, but I think it's also important to be very specific and precise in terms of the measurement of progress against the global goal for adaptation, and which is why the 2-year Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh program is extensively debating the methods and tools which are needed to guide the implementation of the GGA. We wait to see what framework will be agreed at the COP in Dubai. So in today's exchange, we are turning to the topic of building national systems for monitoring, learning, and evaluation to gauge adaptation effectiveness. And we will hear countries' perspectives on how the MEL systems are being built, and a huge welcome to the countries. We will also offer a global perspective on gauging this adaptation progress collectively. And UNDP is very happy to have commissioned a paper by Joel Smith, who we have sharing his ideas today in the webinar, from a technical standpoint, which is far away from the political negotiations. And we're also going to be looking at the issue from a sectoral lens from our colleague from FAO. So I welcome all our speakers. In the past exchanges, we have covered adaptation investment planning, nature for finance, private sector engagement. And we have no doubt that monitoring, evaluation, learning, and these issues are as critical as the issues of implementation and adaptation finance. Without being able to gauge the effectiveness and the returns to adaptation, and how do we avoid risks, we cannot claim to be fully rising up to knowing what is effective adaptation, how we can avoid maladaptation, and how and where to scale up and to have the maximum impact. So now over to my colleague, back to my colleague Prakash Bisra, our moderator, to take us through the session. Over to you, Prakash.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rohini, for those inspirational words, and also for situating the work both globally and in UNDP's ongoing work on adaptation planning, and also on monitoring, evaluating, learning, and reporting, as you pointed out, of adaptation. So let's then move right ahead into the program for today. We are honored to have with us here today Mr. Joel B. Smith, who's joining us from Colorado. Joel is an independent researcher on climate change and also currently a consultant for UNDP. Thank you, Joel, for being with us so early in the morning from your time. We also have with us Ms. Neha Rai, who's the climate change and private sector specialist from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And she's joining us today from Rome. Welcome, Neha. Ms. Catherine Martinez-Hawkins, the coordinator of Adaptation Monitoring and Evaluation System of the Ministry of Environment of Panama, for whom it's quite early as well in the morning, I believe. Bienvenida, Catherine. And last but not least, we have Mr. Jean-Douglas Anaman, climate project manager and technical expert from UNDP in Cote d'Ivoire. Bienvenue, Douglas. So let me invite first Mr. Joel Smith. Joel, whom many of you may know, has been analyzing climate change impacts and adaptation issues for over 3 decades now. He was a coordinating lead author, or the lead author of the 3rd, 4th, and the 5th assessment reports of the IPCC. He was an author of 3 US National Climate Change Assessments, or the NCA, including chapter lead on the international chapter of the 4th NCA. He was the chair of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicines Committee to review the 5th NCA, which completed just last year. And he's also a member of the advisory committee of the US Global Change Research Program. He worked for the US Environmental Protection Agency as a deputy director of Climate Change Division, and recently as special government employee. He has been a consultant with us, with various organizations and the US government since 1992, and is now an independent researcher. Joe will present his most recent work on global stocktake on adaptation, along with a proposal to move forward on measuring progress on adaptation. So Joe, it's a pleasure to have you here with us today. Over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Prakash. I'm going to share my screen and let's make sure that everybody can see it. Can you? All right, can you see the screen?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
All right, very good. So, oh, and by the way, the National Climate Assessment was just released last week. So if you Google U.S. National Climate Assessment, you can find it. So this is a paper that I've been working on with input from my colleagues. Some of them are here on the call, on the webinar, to try to address the global stocktake. It's not, let me make it clear, it's not about the global goal on adaptation, which is also being discussed and negotiated simultaneously. This is really how do we measure progress to those goals and presumably targets whenever they are established. All right, so let's dive in. So the what should the global stocktake on adaptation accomplish? It's basically we're trying to measure progress towards meeting the global goal on adaptation. How are we doing in adapting to climate change? And we need to address this at different scales, everything from the global to the continental, subcontinental, national, even subnational, ideally down to maybe village and individual level if possible. But it should be pointed out, national level progress could well be the focus. We'll see what happens starting in the COP the next week, which starts next week. Now the focus, because the first stocktake, as many of you know, is actually happening this year, and there have already been documents presented. Because that's already happening, this paper, my presentation, is really focusing on the next stocktake 5 years from now, and essentially going to lay out some ideas about where this could go. All right. So there are a number of desirable characteristics for the global stocktake on adaptation with regard to metrics and indicators. First, these metrics and indicators should be meaningful. That is, they should tell us something about how well we are doing in terms of implementing adaptation, but also what effect these adaptations are having. I'll return back to that. They need to be universal in the sense that they need to apply kind of across the world. It shouldn't just work in certain sectors or certain regions of the world or at certain scales. They need to be granular and aggregable. What it means is, it's essentially, another way to put that is scalable, that you can, kind of compare or maybe add them up to see how we're doing, at national, regional, continental, maybe global scales, but also be able to take them down to finer scales like subnational and even local. And then fourth point, and this is very important particularly for developing countries, they have to be feasible. You have to be able to implement these metrics and indicators. Otherwise, it's not going to work. All right, so I want to offer some key considerations about this. First, the global stocktake needs to demonstrate the effectiveness of adaptation in reducing vulnerability to climate change. Okay. The problem here is we don't have a single metric, unlike on mitigation, where we have radiative forcing and we can figure out how the contribution of different gases, greenhouse gases to climate change. We don't have a single metric here. There's a myriad of sectors and impacts, many of which are measured in different ways. So there's no universal metric for measuring vulnerability and adaptation. And we have kind of a very wide array of metrics, some that are in some sectors, some that are better developed than others. So at this point, it's not possible to adopt, at least we don't think it's possible to adopt a comprehensive approach to measuring adaptation. So our suggestion is, let's measure what can be measured. Let's start with what we can measure. In a sense, we are trying to determine the elephant just by feeling different parts of it, but it's a way to begin. And we suggest building on existing metrics and indices. That's because they've already been developed, they're established, many countries are already working with them. And then in some cases, in many cases, there are many metrics, and that would be overwhelming to try to look at dozens of metrics. So indices may need to be developed to combine metrics in a way to make it more understandable about how countries and other levels are doing on adaptation. All right, so I want to begin with I want to talk about the theory of change here. This is key to this because we have inputs essentially to the adaptation policy process. These are things like funding for adaptation, staffing, technology, training, subsidies, that kind of thing. And they lead to what we call outputs. These are sort of the adaptations themselves, what's happening on the ground. And then ultimately, these affect outcomes, which is really well-being, how, what's happening to human health or prosperity or ecosystem health. So an example here is, let's say what we want to do, we want early warning systems, which has been expressed in UNFC discussions. We want those widely installed. Well, one input, there are many, but one could be providing grants for countries to implement, to actually purchase and put in EWSs. And so the input would be the grants. The output would be, are these early warning systems installed? And it's pretty easy to measure and look at the effect of are the grants leading to installation of early warning systems? But then the real question in the long run is, what difference does it make? Are the early warning systems used? Do people follow them? And ultimately, is there effect? Do we reduce mortality, morbidity, that is, life and limb, as well as are we protecting assets? So there's an example of how this theory of change could work out. All right, tying outputs to outcomes, that is the effect of the adaptations on well-being, is harder than tying the inputs, such as like subsidies or grants, to the outputs. With it, you provide a subsidy, does it lead to people implementing a certain program? And this is an interesting example over here this is from a FAO report a couple of years ago, looking at number of people in hunger. And what's interesting, if you look at this figure, you actually saw we were seeing progress, at least starting in 2005, where number of the share of the population who were hungry was decreasing. But then around the year 2018 or so, it started turning up. Now, FAO found that this is probably the result of particularly climate variability, maybe climate change. But attribution is difficult. There are lots of things going on in agriculture. There are changes in farming practices, technologies, government policies, and try to figure out what's going on isn't so easy. So that's why we make this point that tying outputs to outcomes, what's the effect of an adaptation on well-being, is harder than tying inputs to outputs. All right, this is the adaptation policy cycle. Many of you are familiar with it, and it begins by measuring inputs. Are vulnerability, risk assessments being done? Are there plans for adaptation? Then looking at outputs such as our adaptation measures, and then finally looking at monitoring and evaluating adaptations themselves, which really considers inputs, outputs, and ultimately the outcomes. Now, it's important to mention here that the APC is a continuous process, and it's essential for learning and adaptive management, and it straddles inputs, outputs, and outcomes. All right, so here's some examples of inputs. Adaptation plans, National Adaptation Plans. Here's the front of the cover of the NAP for Bhutan, which was just released this year. But there are other things. There's sector plans, many other kinds of plans. Adaptation finance, and by the way, both adaptation plans and finance are being measured in the UNEP gap reports. There's also capacity building, whatever, training, that kind of thing. All right, now a number of outputs are being measured. For example, and this just looks at some funds. The AF is the Adaptation Fund, GCF is the Green Climate Fund, and GEF is the Global Environment Facility. All three are measuring number of beneficiaries. Two of them are measuring assets improved or protected. The Adaptation Fund is measuring meters of coastline protected, as well as early warning systems. And all three are measuring number of hectares improved or protected. So that gets some sense of what's happening on the ground in terms of outputs. Now let's turn to outcomes, because this is challenging, and it's going to be challenging, as I said, to tie the outputs to the outcomes, but there are also a lot of different ways of measuring outcomes. So there are cross-cutting indicators and indices, starting with the Human Development Index, which is really comprised of measurements of human health and essentially income per capita, as well as education, which is not directly tied to climate change, but those are combined into an index of human development. There are sustainable development goals, and in our draft paper, we identify about a dozen of them that we think are directly relevant to climate change. Some are indirectly related, but these are critical measures of outcomes. And the Sendai framework, which has a number of measures which deal with essentially disaster risk reduction. There are also sector outcome indicators. So, for example, in health, the World Health Organization developed the Global Burden of Disease, which, by the way, is actually an index that looks at everything in terms of life expectancy and effects not just of mortality but also morbidity. The Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, has many metrics for measuring food security and has developed a food insecurity experience scale. FAO also has measures on water resources, which they call Aquastat. And then finally, on ecosystem health, the Convention of Biological Diversity is developing indicators of ecosystem health. So those are not quite as well along as the others, but we hope they will come along over the coming years. All right, so for the 2028 stocktake, we're suggesting to focus it and not overreach. We suggest using a small set of output indicators, use existing outcome indices developed by multilateral organizations, and then for subsequent stocktakes, and these, by the way, it's not going to cover everything. Again, we'll measure what we can measure. We're not trying to measure all climate impacts or all adaptations, but for subsequent stocktakes, starting, they go every 5 years, so 2033 and on, we would improve and expand to other sectors, such as particularly biodiversity, but also improve maybe by developing indices and making improvements as we learn and go along. All right, so outcomes, we suggest looking at the following 5 outcomes, all of which are already being measured, by the way: life expectancy, income per capita, percentage of people in poverty, percentage of people malnourished, and water supply per capita. Now, again, this covers some, there's some cross-cutting ones. There's certain sectors, agriculture and water, but other sectors are left out. But these can already be measured. Now, the indices that could be developed, we're suggesting that over coming years there could be measures a sustainable development index, which again could combine a number of sustainable development goals. This could be developed by UNDP, UNEP, FAO. There could be a disaster risk index that could be developed by UNDRR. Food security, FAO is already working on this. Water resources, Aquastat is a start, but FAO might work with the International Water Management Institute to develop an index, in other words, to combine metrics in a way that gives a single result. And then finally, as I mentioned, the Convention of Biodiversity is developing biodiversity and ecosystem measures or metrics, and we would suggest that they combine them in a way to develop indices. And it should mention that the global burden on disease, by the way, in terms of indices, already it is an index, and it's already been applied to look at the effects of climate change on health. So which is exactly what we'd like to see. All right. So then on monitoring and reporting systems, there is this UNFC system that already is incorporated, and it's being expanded. So we have national determined contributions, which are a key reporting mechanism for parties. There also are adaptation communications, but the National Adaptation Plans are going to play a very important role, and they're going to be a very important vehicle, not just for planning, but also for monitoring and evaluation. And then we have the new biennial transparency reports that are going to start next year that will also feed into this process. Now, I think the survey was interesting in the beginning because it looks like more than half of the respondents said they either haven't, they're just starting or in early stages of developing M&E systems. Only about a third said they were somewhat advanced. So this clearly is going to need a lot of support for the development and the enhancement of M&E systems. All right. So again, I want to just close by reiterating some of the key considerations here. First, the key is to demonstrate the effectiveness of adaptations in reducing vulnerability to climate change. That's most important. There are many sectors and impacts of climate change. So because of that, there's no universal metric. So since a comprehensive approach will not work, key is to measure what can be measured. And we suggest building on existing metrics and indices, develop indices to combine metrics, and work to tie outputs to outcomes. That's not easy, as that agriculture example showed, but ultimately we need to show is not just that our adaptation measures being put on the ground, but what good are they doing? So with that, I'll stop and see if I can stop sharing my screen. Okay, here we go. All right.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joel, for your presentation with a very practical proposal on a roadmap to gradually solidifying the global stocktake, grounding it also on the current reality and starting with measure what can be measured. I think that that's really the key. And by the way, Joel's paper has also reviewed a number of different new and emerging work on the topic from various organizations, and building on existing metrics that Joel mentioned and indices, I think is something that resonates probably well amongst the audience members here too. So thank you once again, Joel. If you have any questions for Joel, please feel free to post your questions in the chat box. We will also have an occasion at the end of this webinar to have an open question and answer session. So next we have Ms. Neha Rai with us. Neha is a climate change and private sector specialist currently serving in the Office of Climate Change and Biodiversity at the FAO. She has held roles at organizations such as the FAO, IIED, Sussex Energy Group, and Cenis Environmental Consultancy, where her work revolved around the intersection of climate change, monitoring and evaluation, climate finance, and private sector engagement. Within FAO, Neha is currently engaged in driving initiatives related to climate adaptation, monitoring and evaluation under the enhanced transparency framework of the Paris Agreement. At IIED, she supports the development of M&E systems for climate change in developing countries. She has also played a crucial role in understanding the results management framework of international climate funds and enhancing their support of the BTR reporting. Today, Neha will be walking us through her presentation on using metrics to assess progress towards the GGA, focusing on transparency in the agriculture sectors. Neha, the floor is yours. Hi, Neha, are you there? Okay, yes.
Yes, I am here. I'm just trying to share my screen so you can all see it.
We see your screen as well. Or there's at least there's the slide there already.
Great. Okay. Okay. No, thank you, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to present in this session. I think I'll reiterate on some of the points before going on to discuss about this metric framework that FAO has developed under this publication on how to assess the global goal on adaptation and use the existing M&E frameworks for doing so. You have a QR code if you want to download the publication, which provides this metric framework, or you can download it from the link that I will share later in the webinar. But I'm just delighted to say that this topic is so timely, particularly because the COP is coming up. There will be discussions about the global goal on adaptation in the coming weeks. But also because now we are all in the process of implementing the national climate plans and national adaptation plans, which are already developed by a lot of countries. Almost 40% of the countries have developed NAPs. We know they should be tracking them already, but based on a recent study, we also know that 60% of the countries who have adopted NAPs are not actively tracking the implementation. And this really underlines the role of M&E processes for doing so. Second, as I already mentioned at COP28, we have to adapt a framework for achieving the global goal on adaptation. It's high time and tracking progress against both the GGGA and the adaptation biannual transparency reports, which Joe already mentioned, will be vital from 2024 onwards, even though it remains voluntary at this stage for adaptation. And lastly, we also know that the attempts at demonstrating progress towards this very vaguely worded goal have been challenging. There are methodological challenges, there are conceptual challenges, there are political challenges that the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program aims to address. So at FAO, we are trying to address some of these methodological challenges by introducing this adaptation metric framework that can help countries select specific indicators and metrics to assess adaptation progress within the agriculture sector using agriculture-specific SDG and DRR indicators, which Joe already mentioned we need to build on existing indices and indicators. Now, who is this metric framework targeted towards? If you want to look at the publication, it is primarily towards national decision makers and M&E experts, as well as governments who are trying to monitor, evaluate, learn, and report on adaptation outcomes under national and international mechanisms. And these include progress against NAPs and NDCs. Of course, also sectoral M&Es. In some cases, countries have developed sectoral monitoring evaluation systems, like Cambodia has done one, and reporting on adaptation sections of biannual transparency reports using the agriculture dimensions. But before we delve into the specific metrics and the corresponding agriculture-specific SDG and indicators, I think it's crucial to unpack the domains of the global goal and adaptation, which often gets neglected. And this is what is the foundation of the metric framework, which FAO has tried to propose, which can be universally applied. Now, the global goal in adaptation is to enhance adaptive capacity, strengthen resilience, reduce vulnerability to climate change, with a view to contributing to sustainable development in the context of changing climate. And these 4 domains serve as the foundation of this metric framework. So domain 1 is around climate risks and climate parameters. Domain 2 is vulnerability. Domain 3 is on resilience and adaptive capacity. And domain 4 is on development impacts. In essence, if countries want to assess whether adaptation actions are yielding meaningful results, they must examine whether their adaptation efforts are effectively achieving these 4 key elements. And that's what this metric framework really talks about. Now, how can countries really utilize the metric framework to measure adaptation outcomes by identifying specific indicators? It's important to note that this is not an exhaustive list, and countries may complement with their own context-specific indicators. So it offers a framework, but not a blueprint of indicators, and that's not the intention of the framework. So domain 1, of course, is the climate data, which is the underlying factor across all the 3 domains, where assessing the success of agriculture adaptation efforts is determined based on the context of climate change, which is through climate data such as temperature, precipitation, extreme climate, and weather events. Domain 2 is around to what extent adaptation efforts in the agriculture sectors are reducing vulnerability, where vulnerability is understood as underlying factors that determine the susceptibility of farmers and communities to climate risks and hazards, which play a role in the success of adaptation efforts. So in FAO, the approach to vulnerability includes not only economic and socioeconomic factors, which is the usual theory of change, but also ecological dimensions that hinder, enable, or affect how systems cope with climate hazards and shocks. So these will include indicators such as ecological metrics on natural resources, availability of water, productive lands, and also socioeconomic metrics such as focus on incomes, livelihoods, access to basic services. Just to give you an example of one of those, rationale for the choice of this metric is based on the theoretical evidence that adaptation solutions show success if they help in reducing vulnerability to climate change. For example, as one of our presenters already mentioned, if food security is one of the dimensions of development impact, and it hasn't worsened in the context of changing climate, it implies adaptation solutions have helped in maintaining incomes and making farmers and communities less susceptible to falling down the poverty line. And that's how vulnerability is such a good predictor of development impacts. And these indicators of ecological and socioeconomic metrics can really help in assessing vulnerability reduction. Metrics under domain 3 helps us to know what adaptation efforts are improving resilience and adaptive capacity, where these two dimensions are defined as a system's ability to respond, recover, and address climate-related shocks. FAO defines climate resilience as the ability to prevent disasters, anticipate, absorb, accommodate from disasters and climate change, and restore, protect, and improve livelihood systems. So a lot of indicators related to resilience and adaptive capacity is around the integration of climate change into national policies, how sustainable and resilient ecosystem measures are taking place, how sustainable and resilient food production systems are being developed. So these are the metrics which can really help in assessing the domain 3 of the global goal. Finally, the last domain is around the extent to which all these efforts are contributing to sustainable development. And that requires measuring development impacts using standard development indicators such as well-being, food security. Joe already mentioned about some of these indicators, agriculture productivity, loss and damage, that can help countries determine if adaptation actions are also delivering development impacts and should be assessed after a climate shock or stress, as it can provide insight into whether adaptation efforts are effective in the long run. Now, I know this slide is a bit difficult to read, but it helps us to know how we can use some of the SDG and DRR indicators within the 4 domains that I tried to explain earlier. So FAO is a designated custodian agency for a significant number of SDG indicators. And as a result, there are developed robust methodologies for 18 of these indicators. So these indicators are comparable and aggregable at various levels. So countries can really leverage these SDG and Sendai framework indicators to, I'll go back a bit, to use them as proxies for assessing and appraising levels of climate risk exposure, vulnerability, adaptive capacity, and development impacts. Now, the benefit of using these indicators is that it decreases the reporting burden. As I mentioned, it's aggregable, it's context specific, which are the challenges which Sharm el-Sheikh work program is trying to address. Besides the global goal of adaptation, this framework can also be used to assess and track climate change adaptation in the agriculture sector, particularly for reporting on the BTRs. As you all know, Chapter 4 of the BTR biennial transparency reports, which will be submitted, which are voluntary from next year, is focused on adaptation. And the chapter 4 has certain information which will be shared. One is the context setting background information, more ex-ante information on adaptation strategies and priorities, and the ex-post information on how countries are performing as a result of these efforts on adaptation. The metric framework can be particularly useful for elements E and F, which is on progress on implementation and M&E of adaptation actions of the BTR, for reporting on how agriculture actions are showing performance in terms of improving resilience and reducing vulnerability to climate change, and can be used for the enhanced transparency framework and the BTRs that will be submitted by countries. As I mentioned, these BTRs are voluntary, but countries are more and more interested in submitting them, primarily because they can be a way to assess national response to climate change, as well as making sure that we can access to finance by showing adaptation actions are working or not working. I see Prakash has put on his video, so he wants to probably stop me. But I think one thing I want to say, I don't want to go through all the slides, but one last point I want to make is that while this framework allows countries to define context-specific outcomes and impact indicators, and it can be used for aggregation and ensuring uniformity, it's also one of the indicators that needs to be informed by bottom-up results. So what is happening at the local level in countries should be supported in this is kind of reporting, where you have more localized impact evaluation, localized assessments of whether adaptation is working or not. So these aggregable results should also be informed by more impact evaluations, climate risk assessment evaluations, using tools like SHARP, which FAO has been using quite a lot on the ground, not only to show that the results are working, but validating those results in general in some cases, so that they're not just high-level, broad assumptions. But I'll stop there, and feel free to download this publication and get in touch if you have a question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neha, for your presentation, and I'm sorry to cut you short. But it is quite challenging to fit the wealth of information that you have to share today in a 10-minute slot. I know, and thank you for trying to stick there. Indeed, as you mentioned, alignment of the metric framework with the GGA domains is a very logical way forward in measuring adaptation outcomes. And what you mentioned as well on context specificity, while enabling uniformity and aggregability. I mean, I think I heard that from Joe's presentation as well earlier, and that is the key, isn't it? To try to keep that granularity and the aggregability of these frameworks. Thank you so much once again. For the audience members, if you have any questions for Neha as well, please feel free to put your questions in the chat box, and we will be addressing those in the order that they are received. Now, next we have I have the pleasure, in fact, of inviting Ms. Catherine Martinez-Hawkins to this virtual podium. Catherine is the climate change analyst at the Ministry of Environment of the Republic of Panama. And she's also the coordinator of the monitoring and evaluation systems for adaptation to climate change and loss and damage. She is a negotiator under the UNFCCC on topics of agriculture and transparency. She holds an environmental engineering degree from the Technological University of Panama. And Catherine will today introduce Panama's M&E system on adaptation and how the learning is helping strengthen the iterative nature of adaptation now. So please, Catherine, Alstead.
Thank you very much. Good morning and good evening to everyone. And thank you for the opportunity to present the M&E system of Panama. And just to make sure in the presentation, it's in the second slide and full screen.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Well, in 2016, Panama ratified the Paris Agreement. And after that, in 2020, we presented our updated NDC, which includes among its commitment, our National Climate Transparency Platform. After that, in 2021, we started our M&E system and ratified our M&E and established, our M&E system by the Executive Decree 135, and we presented 21 indicators of adaptation. In 2022, we started a collaboration to strengthen our M&E system for adaptation, and we elaborate indicators for loss and damage. At the end of this year, 2022, we presented 16 indicators of loss and damage. And this year, we are starting another collaboration to strengthen our M&E system, and we presented all the information we have collected in both system and our National Transparency Platform. Both M&E systems are based on an extensive literature review of various entities with experience and reporting climate change indicators. We have adapted some international indicators to our national reality. We have established working groups to consult and compile existing information and validate the information that the indicators include. And we started a process to have a systematizing information and to collect continuous data. For the construction of both systems, a series of steps were followed, starting with meeting with parties that are NGOs and other entities, public and private entities that collect information related to adaptation. After that, we constructed theories of change with the parties. And after that, we started the data collection and systematization of the information. We prepared protocols for obtaining the information. We validated the information with the parties and presented the results. And after that, we initiated the institutionalization and the updating of the indicators. These are the parts which we can appreciate of both systems as a unit, but separately they are very different, and it's important to highlight that our systems have been elaborated on basis of small, non-reimbursable projects. Our first M&E system for adaptation was made with financial resources of the Adaptation Fund. The second phase, that is the strengthening of the monitoring and evaluation system and the construction of loss and damage M&E system, was made with resources of Initiative for Climate Action Transparency, ICAT, and all the information that it's on our platform was made or include with the collaboration of CVID Project and Climate Promise. As I mentioned, we have in total 37 indicators. 16 indicators for loss and damage, and 21 indicators for adaptation. In the case of the indicators of adaptation, 12 of the indicators represent adaptation measures, 6 indicators present adaptation results, and 3 climate impacts. On the other hand, this indicator, 14 indicators of the 21 can represent adaptive capacity. 5 of the indicators represent sensitivity, and 2 exposition. In the case of loss and damage, 8 of the 16 indicators represent management, 4 indicators represent economic losses, and 4 indicators represent non-economic losses. On the other hand, those indicators are also related to extreme weather events, slow onset events, finance, and one of the 16 indicators can represent slow onset events and extreme weather events in its information. This is the Panama's Climate Transparency Platform, where we have all the information that we have been collecting these years, and we have the information related to the indicators. And for this presentation, I want to highlight some challenges. Of course, we have more than those challenges, but first, we think that the information for decision making is our main challenge. We would like to use the information that the indicators present to consistently interpret the outcomes of adaptation and loss and damage to see how much the country is progressing, or which things we will have to make in order to achieve progress in adaptation. Also, another challenge is keeping key stakeholders engaged. The participation and involvement of key actors for the correct and regular provision of data is very complicated, but we think that's the main important thing to have a very good M&E system. Another challenge could be the technical and financial resource. Has presented, this M&E system have been made by many small projects, and continuously strengthen the things and capabilities in the prioritized topics like adaptation and loss and damage is a very important thing for us, and to have a permanent technical staff to ensure the continuity of the system. Some lessons learned that we have gathered in the construction of these M&E systems are that the validation of indicators is a fundamental process to improve data evaluation. The success of an indicator depends on its functionality and not so much on the need to monitor and evaluate a national reality. The involvement of the regional offices of the institution is very important to achieve national objectives. Interinstitutional cooperation is necessary for the sustainability of the indicators over time. Collaboration through institutional arrangements is essential, and the feedback provided by the stakeholders is important for the strengthening of the team and the indicators. And some of the things that we have plans for as a next steps for next year is to receive a M&E system functionality assessment and to start a second phase of collaboration with ICAT to continue strengthening our M&E systems and to solve some aspects that we have from the last cooperation. On second hand, we would like to have a strategy to try to work on climate displaced people and develop a section of displaced person in our platform. Also, we would like to continue our capacity building and strengthen the M&E module that is in the platform of transparency. And thank you very much for your attention. If there is any question, I will very happy to answer.
Muchas gracias, Catherine, for that very rich presentation from your end as well. Not only taking us through your MEL system on adaptation, but also on loss and damage, and also highlighting some of the challenges and lessons that you've learned. What you just mentioned in the presentation on keeping key stakeholders engaged, I think it's a challenge that a lot of us face in a lot of the processes that we follow as well. Just on a maybe lighter note, we just lost about 30 participants here in the webinar as well. So how do you keep them engaged, right? Not because of you though. And how to incentivize them into being active participants in the monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems. But thank you once again for your intervention. Next and last but not least, I have the pleasure of inviting Monsieur Jean Douglas Anaman. Douglas has over 15 years of experience working in forest natural resources management and 10 years in climate policy. He's an he's an adaptation and climate policy expert and coordinator of the NAP project, the SCALA project, and the Climate Promise in UNDP Cote d'Ivoire. Douglas today will take us through Cote d'Ivoire's journey in building an effective monitoring, evaluation, and learning system for climate resilience. À vous, Douglas.
Thank you, dear Prakash. Hi, dear colleague and dear participants. So I'm Jean Douglas and I'm from UNDP Cote d'Ivoire. So I will speak in French and let the translator make the translation for you. Yes, je vais vous entretenir très rapidement sur l'expérience en Côte d'Ivoire qu'on a eue à travers donc les différents dispositifs de suivi et évaluation, aussi bien pour l'atténuation que l'adaptation au changement climatique. Slide.
Côte d'Ivoire. We need to say that between 2015 and 2022, Côte d'Ivoire has improved the M&E process. So we're talking about a favorable environment. That's why Côte d'Ivoire was involved in a mitigation MRV system for CDN. When we opened the second phase of our process, we managed to implement some great indicators for the mitigation. Those indicators have been implemented with a mitigation MRV system for CDN. You can click on this link and you will have access to the MRV platform for the mitigation. This platform involves different indicators, data and indicators required regarding the potential reduction of GHG baseline by action, the effective reduction generated by activity implemented, and the resources needed and the resources mobilized. We have also implemented an adaptation MRV system for the NAP. Now we have a National Adaptation Plan, which is going to be ratified soon. The adaptation MRV system is granted with the technical indicators data based on 85 options identified. So we have identified 85 options identified. More to the point, the impact, effect, result, product, activities indicators are 345. In addition to those 345 indicators, we also have 8 financial indicators. So you have some great achievements made by Côte d'Ivoire between 2015 and 2022. We have other processes. We have the specific MRV systems involving various institutions. We have the MRV Energy by GIZ. We have the MRV Climate Finance by ICAT. And we also have the MNV Agroforestry by GIZ. We have some good practices, but we also have to face challenges. So when we're talking about lessons learned, best practices, strengths and weaknesses, what are the lessons learned? We have realized that the implementation of the comprehensive approach based on the sectorial systems are very important. That's why comprehensive approaches and operationalized MRV and MNE systems are mandatory. These to fight climate change. We have also realized that inclusiveness and consideration for social and gender aspects are necessary to identify the best indicators for adaptation. It has helped us to design the right indicators and metrics taking into account gender and social items. One of the lessons learned is the provision of ICT equipment, which is very, very important. That's why we have supplied to the different projects many computing software equipments to enable to those sectors to be operational, to implement the implementation of those systems. Most of the time, we understand that we have many data and indicators. One of the major indicator, which has been highlighted by my colleague from Panama, is the institutional arrangement and the partnership to collect data. This is to be efficient, to provide data and to maintain and to feed this data collection process. Another very important item is a partnership, because we are in an environment when we need to build partnerships. We have many partners. That's why the benchmarking, the partnership, and the multi-partner engagements are very, very relevant. Indeed, we have to face challenges. One of the first challenge is the coordination in MRV and MNE systems, which is currently lacking. The adaptation matrix is complicated as we have various sectoral indicators. How to build, by the way, a solid and efficient institutional framework, data collection, process, and coordination around management. We need also to understand how these systems help to have prepared BTR. We also need a transparency framework, and this is the fourth challenge. How these systems help to have prepared BTR. One of a very important element is the private sector, which needs to have a role in the running and build up of the MRV and MNE. MNE being the monitoring and evaluation. We are in a very difficult and competitive environment. A support should be provided to the private sector. And for sure, the challenges met by Côte d'Ivoire are more or less the same challenges faced by most of the developing countries. And it is important to understand how to measure mitigation and adaptation indicators if most of our climate actions are based on project approaches that are not project approaches. Now, the pathways to go ahead. Through the UNDP FAO SCALA programs, FAO is finalizing a gap and institutional analysis of all these MRV and MNE systems. The second pathway is the SCALA approach, which is also essential as an initiative in helping mobilizing partnership to concretize the roadmap. The third pathways to go ahead is the private sector engagement oriented approaches needs to be integrated in the future system to guarantee its sustainability. Some takeaway. Côte d'Ivoire is benefiting from an enabling environment which has helped to develop the MRV and MNE systems for NAP and NDC, including a set of indicators chosen with participatory processes. Now there is a challenge to harmonize institutional coordination and simplify the reporting burden. Capacity building and IT building is necessary to sustain reporting, which is also benefiting from SCALA support. This is also responding to a national willingness to be able to report on climate policy without or with minimal external support. SCALA is contributing to harmonize and support MRV and MNE for climate policies. Côte d'Ivoire case shows that developing indicators and systems can be achieved with political momentum. The next stage would be to enhance coordination for effectiveness, to hold dialogue between peers to simplify the reporting needs while keeping quality data. I think the next stage also will be to fine-tune MRV or MN indicators accessible to private sector capacities to help them in getting on board. SCALA is helping us to contribute to better understand the MRV support to analyze the gaps, especially the gaps. Côte d'Ivoire is echoing all the challenges that have been identified. We can comment on the next stages. We need an enhanced coordination for effectiveness. We need to hold top dialogue between peers, and we need to fine-tune MRV and MN indicators. Thank you very much for your attention. Really appreciate.
Je vais donner quelques secondes pour les traducteurs pour interprétation avant de commencer. So, thank you once again, Douglas, for your very succinct presentation, focusing not only on the lessons learned and the challenges, but also your pathways to move forward, looking at different partnerships, and you stress the importance of partnership as well to come up with roadmap. Indeed, I don't think Côte d'Ivoire is the only one at all to face these challenges in isolation, and indeed many developing countries have the same issues. So so now we're coming towards the end of the webinar. We've looked at not only a proposal for a global stocktake using indices and metrics and sectoral point of view of the agriculture sector perspective, but also had some examples coming from countries on how they are approaching their M&E system. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists today for the insights that they've shared with us. We still have a little bit of time for questions and answers. So I'd now like to open the floor for the audience or to our speakers as well, if they've got any questions for each other. Please raise your hands or just put your questions in the chat box, and we will tend to them in the order that they are received. So the floor is open. All right, I don't see any questions there. There were some questions.
Akash, you're on mute.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, no, it's fine. No, it was just a sec.
Okay, right. So Joe, I think you had your hand raised, and then we have Tiano Mamadou Diallo next. So please, Joe.
Okay, thank you. So there were a couple of questions regarding sort of approaches that combine measurements across sectors. So, for example, ND gain, which has been around for a while, that measures vulnerability. There also, and the point is that there's not a single universal metric for adaptation or for vulnerability to begin with, that would then enable you to sort of directly compare the effective adaptations on vulnerability. There are ways of combining looking at different sectors. One is expressing everything in monetary terms, putting everything in terms of dollars or whatever monetary units you want to use. This is widely applied by a number of economists. It's also applicable to loss and damage, because in many ways that will expressing the loss and damage in monetary terms will allow for some payments. These are controversial. Okay, because how do you value things that are not in markets, such as beginning with human life or ecosystem valuation? That's a problem. The thought was that working through individual sectors, particularly where there has been a lot of work, and we've seen it from FAO, from others, other organizations, that may in some ways be more fruitful. The other problem with sort of aggregating up is you can get something that, okay, you have a combined metric, but then what does it mean? Ultimately, I think if you're informing the UNFCCC and parties about what progress is being made in adaptation, in some ways you probably want to disaggregate somewhat, at least look at where are in terms of sectors and even subsectors, what specific aspects of water resources or agriculture or ecosystems are making progress on adaptation or lagging. So it's not easy. Okay, these can be combined, but I think you also need processes that allow for some reasonable disaggregation, so one can sort of look at where progress is being made and not being made. But this is a very challenging. So this all is very challenging in terms of how one combines or doesn't combine these things. So thanks.
Thanks, Joel. I think we had another hand raised earlier. I do not see him anymore. Monsieur Diallo. Allez-y.
Please go ahead, Mr. Diallo.
Go ahead. I think you're on mute.
Votre micro est éteint, Monsieur Diallo.
Okay, while that technical, okay, there you go. I think now you have your mic on as well. Please go ahead.
Allô, Monsieur Prakash? Allô?
Oui? Allez-y, monsieur.
Hello, sorry.
On vous entend pas très clair.
We cannot hear you, Mr. Diallo.
On vous entend pas très bien, monsieur.
The interpreter would like to apologize, but speaker sound is very low. L'interprète s'excuse, mais le son de l'orateur est extrêmement faible. On ne peut pas entendre.
Ok. Je dis que Madame Oumou Doumbouya devait faire une présentation par rapport à...
Okay, all right, yeah, your speaker is really low, and the interpreters are also having difficulty hearing you. If you can perhaps connect to another device. Otherwise, if there are any other questions from the floor or from the speakers as well, if you have any questions for the other presenters, and Monsieur Diallo, if you wouldn't mind putting your question in the chat box. Rohini, please come in. You're muted. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. I hope you can hear me. Is that okay now? Okay, I think there's quite a few questions in the chat, some excellent questions. So I think we do need to see, I think Joel has answered some important ones, but there are a couple of questions. I think there is an anonymous participant who asked, when did MNE become MEL? Is it now accepted, and who made that decision? And yes, learning is important, but it affects how we traditionally consider MNE. That's a very good question. So the discussion about learning, using monitoring evaluation for learning, it's very much something which communities through the locally led action track on adaptation have been really emphasizing the point, because monitoring and evaluation is not supposed to be just for the for the investor or the donor, to see some results, but it really has to reach the benefits, on the ground. And it also because many adaptation options have not been, fully tested. The idea of M&E is not only to verify the impact, but also to learn from it. So this is why the community of locally led adaptation actors, community-based adaptation actors have been talking all about learning. And I think that this discussion about learning on M&E is much bigger than climate. Even on development issues, there's a big discussion on that. And this is, I think the question is, when was this decision made? I mean, this is not a point for negotiations. This is the way a lot of monitoring and evaluation systems are moving in that direction. So, but there's no one approach that has been adopted or a decision taken, but largely the movement has been to make sure that there's a strong component of learning, so that it's not only about accountability to the donor investors, but that people can learn and take different decisions, for adaptive management. So just to say that, and I think it's gradually becoming more accepted, but ultimately it's really up to the initiative or the countries to decide whether they want to take that approach. So I think that's probably one question. And I think, Prakash, maybe you could look, I think there are a couple of other questions in the chat. One, I think, very difficult question on looking at the policy decisions with permanence bias and traditional development models. How can these proposed actions accelerate measures needed for real mitigation and adaptation? I'm not sure if I fully understand the question. Maybe we could ask for a clarification, but let me go back to you on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohini. Yes, indeed. Wary of the time constraint as well. We're 2 minutes to the end of the webinar. So it's funny that I don't see the same questions here. But thank you for picking up on that one on MEL. And indeed, learning is a critical aspect of any monitoring and evaluation system these days. So we're about a minute away from our closing, but before I close, well, first of all, we will get to all these questions that were posted here on the chat. We will reach out to you with a response as soon as possible after the webinar. But before we close, and since we're also just a week away from COP, I just quickly wanted to introduce our transparency clinic that UNDP will be hosting at COP28. There you have it. You see it on the slide here, providing technical advisory services on anything under the sun, basically, as it relates to Article 13 of the Paris Agreement. Which this is, of course, we're leveraging on the expertise that we have within UNDP and across our network of partners. The clinics will be held in meeting room 36 from the 9th to the 12th. That you see on the right side of the slide. In the bottom, highlighted in yellow. Please do take note of those times that you have there, time slots. And there's a link there as well for booking. This will be provided to all the participants in this webinar. There's also a number of thematic sessions in the mornings in the same meeting room on integrating gender considerations on the 9th of December, tracking adaptation and opportunities to report on loss and damage on the 10th, and digital NDC tracking system demo on the 11th of December. These will all take place in the morning, and so please do take note of this and do circulate it to amongst your network, and we do hope to see you there. Now, once again, I would like to thank all of our panelists, Joe, Neha, Catherine, Jean-Douglas, for having taken their time, and Rohini, of course, for having taken their time to share with us their work today. And I wish you all a great day, evening, night, or morning, and hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much.